Then Walker slammed his winning cards face up on that table, and the whole saloon went dead quiet because Silas Bennett wasn't pushing a pile of gold coins across the felt, pushing his daughter. She's yours now, Cowboy. The debt she carries, every breath she owes me. Ethan stood up so fast, his chair cracked against the floor. Don't own people. But Silas just smiled the kind of smile that had buried men twice Ethan's size. In the back of that smoky room, a woman was already planning to disappear before morning. This story hits you right in the heart. Subscribe to this channel. Follow along until the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The poker game had been going for 6 hours. Ethan Walker hadn't planned on staying past the second deal into Tucson that afternoon to pick up fencing wire and a new saddle cinch, maybe eat something that wasn't his own cooking, and get back to the ranch before the stars came out. Clean, the kind of life he'd built on purpose. But then Pete Calloway had grabbed his arm at the saloon door and said, "Walker, I got a seat with your name on it, Ethan." And Ethan, who almost never gambled, sat down. He almost always regretted that word. Almost. 6 hours later, he was sitting on a hand that had cost him 2 months of careful saving pocket aces, backed by 3 queens drawn in the final round. Ethan, a full house that would have made most men shout loud enough to rattle the rafters. Just laid them down quiet. He didn't shout. He didn't grin. He looked across the table at Silas Bennett, a man who wore his money like armor and his cruelty like cologne, and he waited, got very still. Silas Bennett stared at those cards for a long moment. A man like him was never still. He was always calculating, always reading angles, always working some invisible machinery behind those flat gray eyes. He went quiet. Every man in that saloon felt the temperature drop. Silas reached into his vest pocket, and he didn't pull out money. He pulled a piece of paper, folded once, yellowed at the edges. Document, the kind of document that had been carried around for a long time, waiting for the right moment, on top of Ethan's winning hand. "What's this?" Ethan asked. His voice was level. His jaw was not. "Legal transfer of debt," Silas said, leaning back like a man completely at ease. "Your daughter, Clara. You may have seen her around town. She owes a considerable sum, $200 to be precise, accumulated during her late husband's final illness. Bank loans, the doctor bills, the burial costs." He paused. "Let that number sit on the table like a stone, carrying that note as her guarantor. As of tonight, I'm transferring it to you, along with everything that comes attached to it." Ethan didn't touch the paper. "Everything attached to it mean?" Silas smiled. "It means my daughter. Mr. Walker, you've won yourself a wife." That followed was so complete that a man could hear the oil burning in the lanterns overhead. Then the entire saloon erupted. Some men laughed, the uncomfortable kind, the kind men use when they don't know whether they're witnessing something funny or something terrible. A few whistled. Pete Calloway muttered "Lord Almighty" into his whiskey glass. The barkeep set down the bottle he was holding very carefully, like he was afraid of making noise. Ethan didn't move. He sat there looking at that paper, at Silas Bennett's self-satisfied face, at the laughing mouths of men who thought this was entertainment, and something cold and quiet settled into his chest. Picked up the paper between 2 fingers, the way you'd pick up something you intended to throw away. "Make sure I understand you," he said. His voice was soft. It's the only warning anyone who knew Ethan Walker would have needed. "Telling me that your daughter, a grown woman, is something you can hand over in a card game. She's a debt, son. A liability. I'm transferring the liability. She's a person. She's a widow with no income. No property. No prospects. $5,200 of debt that she cannot pay." Silas spread his hands open, the picture of reasonableness. "You've done her a favor. You're a landowner. You've got a working ranch. You do a great deal. Worse. Does she know you're doing this?" Flickered behind Silas's eyes. Not guilt men, like Silas Bennett didn't carry guilt. They traded it away for something more useful long ago. Something. A hesitation. "Clara knows what her situation is. It's not what I asked. Silas's expression hardened. The debt is legally transferable, Mr. Walker. I suggest you read the paperwork before you get righteous on me. You won the game. These are the stakes. Ethan stood up. He didn't grab his money. He didn't storm out. He folded the paper once, twice, and put it in his shirt pocket, quickly over his heart. He won. Because he'd already decided what he was going to do with it, and he needed to find the woman first. He asked, "She has a room at the boarding house on Mesquite Street." Silas tilted his head, watching Ethan with new eyes, now eyes that were taking his measure, recalculating. Think about tearing that up, Walker. It's a legally binding document. Ethan looked at him. I'm going to go talk to your daughter, Mr. Bennett, as a human being, and whatever happens next, you and I are done. He walked out of that saloon, and the sound of the room followed him into the night like something he'd never be able to fully leave behind. The house in Mesquite Street was quiet when Ethan arrived. Most of the windows were dark. A dog barked somewhere down the alley and then stopped. The night air smelled like desert and distant rain, a smell Ethan had always loved, had always found peaceful, but his heart was doing something he hadn't felt in years. Something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but sat somewhere between the two. He knocked on the door and explained himself to the woman who answered, Mrs. Holt, who ran the boarding house and clearly didn't appreciate visitors at this hour. But she'd heard about the poker game. News traveled fast in Tucson, especially news of the spectacular and ugly variety. Bennett is in room 6, she said. Top of the stairs, second door. Though I'll warn you, she's in a strange way tonight. Came home early from her father's supper and hasn't made a sound since. Don't like it. Ethan climbed the stairs. Room 6 had a strip of light under the door, lamplight, thin and steady. He raised his hand to knock and then stopped. Because he could hear movement inside. Quiet, purposeful movement. The sound of a drawer being opened and closed. The soft thud of something set carefully into a bag. Rustling of fabric being folded. She was packing. Not the slow, tired packing of someone moving to a new room. The fast, controlled packing of someone who had a plan and a timeline and was already 3 steps into executing it. Ethan knocked. The movement inside stopped instantly. Miss Bennett, he said. My name is Ethan Walker. I was at the poker game tonight. I'd like to talk to you, not as anything your father told you I am, just as a person. More silence, then the sound of a latch being carefully turned. The door opened 4 inches. A single eye looked out, dark brown, sharp, and utterly without fear. Surprised him. He'd expected fear. Instead, he saw something fiercer than fear. He saw a woman taking his measure. What do you want? Her voice was quiet and completely steady. To give you this, he said. He pulled the folded paper from his shirt pocket and held it out. Looked at it. What is that? The debt transfer document. Your father gave it to me with the poker winnings. You know what it is. Her jaw tightened. Why are you giving it to me? Because it belongs to you. It's a document about your life. You should be the one holding it. She opened the door a little wider. Still not enough to step through. Enough that he could see her face, fully now angular, posed. There was shadows under her eyes that hadn't come from tonight. Shadows were older than tonight. You could have torn it up downstairs. It occurred to me, he admitted, but tearing it up doesn't fix your debt. And I thought maybe you deserved to be consulted before anyone made decisions about your situation. It at him for a long moment. Mr. Walker. Mr. Walker, she said it deliberately, not rudely but firmly, the woman establishing terms. I was getting ready to leave tonight. Plan, and I have enough money saved to get myself as far as New Mexico, where I have a cousin who owes me a favor. 3 years, I can earn enough to start paying back the debt. It's not a comfortable plan, but it's mine. Okay, he said. Okay, if that's what you want, I won't stop you. Just wanted you to know that there's another option if you want it. The door a full foot now, cautious and suspicious in equal measure. What option? Ethan took a breath. This was the part he'd been working out in his head the entire walk from the saloon, and it still sounded half crazy when he ran it through his mind. It was the only thing that made sense. A marriage in name only, he said. On paper, so your father can't claim authority over you or the debt anymore. You'd come to the ranch, your own room. own life. Zom, your own choices. Comes off your record because as my legal wife, my credit covers it. Maybe two, when you've figured out what you actually want, we file for an annulment. And quiet, you walk away free. Clara Bennett stared at him for so long that Ethan started to wonder if he'd said something wrong. Don't know me, she finally said. No, I could be a terrible person. I've been lonely long enough that I'm willing to take the risk. He hadn't meant to say that last part. It came out before he could catch it. He watched something shift in her expression, not softening exactly, but adjusting. You don't know me either. He added, I could be terrible. Everyone at the saloon seemed to think you were decent. People at saloons have been wrong before. The corner of her mouth moved. Quite a smile, but the possibility of one. Why would you do this? You don't owe me anything. Ethan thought about Silas Bennett's face when he'd laid down that paper, the casual way he'd done it, as though his daughter were a line item on a balance sheet. It's because somebody should have told your father no a long time ago. He said, and I'm in a position to do it, so I'm doing it. Looked at the paper, still held between them. I had it for a long time. Then she took it. To agree to my terms, she said. Name them. Come on, I'm not a housekeeper. I'll work. I'll work hard, but we decide together what that looks like. Don't take orders. Neither do I, and I'd never ask you to. At any point I feel unsafe, I leave. No questions, no arguments. Without hesitation. And if either of us develops feelings, real ones, we talk about it like adults instead of pretending it isn't happening. One surprised him. He'd expected practical demands. What he got instead was emotional intelligence, a woman who'd been burned before and was building the fire break early. He said. She nodded once, decisive. Then I'll come to your ranch, mister. On a trial basis. Ethan, on a trial basis, she repeated. It doesn't work. We go back to my original plan. She held out her hand. He shook it. It was firm, and her eyes were steady, and Ethan Walker, who had spent the last 10 years building walls around everything soft inside him, felt one of those walls develop a crack so small he almost didn't notice it. Almost they were married the next morning. The justice of the peace in Tucson was a rangy, bespectacled man named Judge Harold Ferris, who had seen enough of human desperation to be unsurprised by unusual arrangements. The vows, with professional dispassion, he then stamped the certificate, charged them $4, which Ethan paid without blinking. He wore a plain blue dress. Ethan wore his least worn work shirt and his good boots. No flowers, no guests, no celebration. When it was done, Clara folded her copy of the certificate into her travel bag beside the debt transfer document, and they walked out into the early morning sun as legally married strangers. Ethan asked. I've been worse, she said. It wasn't exactly romantic, but it was honest, and somehow that felt more solid than any flower-strewn fantasy could have. Retrieved their horses from the livery. Clara had her own, a thin-legged brown mare. She called Penny, beloved, and clearly half-starved, and Ethan tried not to think too hard about what he just agreed to as they rode out of Tucson toward the open desert. Not to think about the fact that he'd started this morning intending to buy fencing wire. The ride to the ranch took most of the day. He didn't talk much at first. Not awkward silence, more like two people who understood that they were sizing on each other up with every mile, and words would come when they were ready. Around noon, they stopped to water the horses at a rocky creek, and Clara knelt beside the water and filled her canteen with the practiced efficiencies of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. When she stood up, she caught Ethan watching her. What? She said. Nothing. I just realized I don't know much about you. Father didn't exactly give me a biography. What do you want to know? You want to tell me? She considered that while she recorked her canteen in New Mexico. My father moved us to Arizona when I was 16, after he made money in silver. Thomas, my husband, when I was 20. We were married 4 years. When he got sick 2 years in, consumption. She said it plainly, without flinching. People talk about painful things they've already processed 100 times. He died 11 months ago. I'm sorry. So am I. She looked at the water moving over the rocks. This was a good man. Not perfect, no one is but good. He would have hated knowing what my father did with his debts. It's your plan. Before tonight, before the game, Thomas and I were going to build a ranch. A small one horses, maybe a small herd. We had a vision for it. We'd been saving. She paused. The savings went to the doctor's on, and then the rest went to the funeral. And then my father stepped in as guarantor on the remaining debt. And that was the moment I knew I'd lost the last piece of what Thomas and I had built. Until tonight. Until tonight, when my father sold it to a stranger in a card game. Her voice didn't waver, but her hands tightened briefly on the canteen strap. Been in trying to control me since Thomas died. He sees me as an asset, something with value to be leveraged. Wrong about that. She looked at him then, a long measuring look. Say that, like it's simple. It is simple. Men who talk like that usually stop meaning it when it becomes inconvenient. He said it without drama, without performance. The way you say something that is simply true. I gave you my word this morning, Clara. Your word is worth something. Whether it's convenient or not. She held his gaze, and then she nodded, a single, slow nod that felt like something being cataloged. Evidence to be weighed. We'll see, she said. He mounted back up and kept riding. 2 hours from the ranch when Silas Bennett's man found them. Ethan heard the horse before he saw it coming fast, kicking up a dust cloud on the ridge trail to the east. He shifted his right hand before the rider came into view. Habit, from years of range work and one or two situations that had required quick thinking. It was just Cray Dawson, one of Silas' hired men, young and sweating, and looking like he'd ridden hard for an hour. And Mr. Walker. He reined in beside them, breathing almost as hard as the horse. Bennett sent me. Why? Ethan's voice was flat. Eyes flicked to Clara, back to Ethan. He says the marriage this morning wasn't part of the deal. The transfer was the stakes, not a full legal arrangement. He says you've overstepped. A beat of silence. Then Clara spoke. My father. Tell my father, she said, her voice perfectly calm, that the marriage is legal and witnessed and filed with Judge Ferris's office. He wants to contest it. He's welcome to speak to a lawyer. She paused. Then tell him that I hope he has a very comfortable life. Looked miserable. Mrs. Walker. He's not going to He's not going. To what? She said. He's not going to let it stand? He doesn't have a choice. He transferred the debt legally. He had no authority over me the moment that document was signed. She tilted her head, and something in her expression made the young rider lean back slightly in his saddle. Mr. Dawson? Dawson looked at Ethan. Ethan said nothing. Just waited. Yes, ma'am, Dawson said, and wheeled his horse back toward the eastern ridge. He watched him go. That was well done, Ethan said. Preparing for that conversation for 11 months, Clara said. The only thing that changed is the specific words. Hold on. The ranch came into view at dusk. There wasn't much to look at, not yet. The main house needed paint in several places, and one of the barn doors hung at a slightly wrong angle, and the fence along the eastern pasture had a section that wanted replacing. The kind of details you accumulate when you're one man running a place that was built for two. But the land was good. Ethan knew land the way some men know horses or music instinctively in his bones. And the Walker Ranch sat on soil that had a particular quality of richness to it, something that held moisture and promise in equal measure. Sheila sat her horse at the rise before the driveway and looked at it in the fading light. She didn't say anything for a full minute. Ethan waited. The east pasture could support a small horse breeding operation. She finally said, the grass is what it looks like from here. Ethan blinked. I had the same thought 2 years ago. Never had the capital to start it. Looked at him sideways. Maybe that's something we talk about. Maybe it is. They rode down to the house. Ranch hands, old Jorge Medina, young Billy Taft, and the taciturn Will Crane were still working near the barn when they arrived. 3 men who had worked for Ethan long enough to know that he didn't do things without reasons and who had the good sense not to ask questions about a man arriving home with a wife he hadn't left with. He touched his hat. Evening, Mr. Walker. Ma'am, Jorge. This is Clara Walker. She'll be staying. Mrs. Walker, Jorge said, and smiled the genuine, warm smile of a man who had been quietly worried about his boss's loneliness for longer than he'd ever say. It's good to have someone in that house. Clara looked at the old man, and something in her face went soft for just a moment, just a breath of a moment before it resettled. Thank you, she said. I'll try not to be a disruption. Oh, a little disruption's good for a place like this, Jorge said comfortably. Keeps things from going stiff. Billy Taft was staring with unconcealed curiosity until Will Crane elbowed him without looking up from the saddle he was repairing. Ethan showed Clara through the house. It was clean, he kept it clean. He'd always insisted on that much, but it was sparse in the way of a man who'd stopped believing the space was worth decorating. A kitchen that functioned, a sitting room with 2 chairs and a cold fireplace. A hallway leading to 3 rooms, only one of which held a made-up bed. This one's yours, Ethan said, opening the door to the largest of the 3 windows, and caught the evening breeze and was completely empty except for a bed frame and a chest of drawers. To a mattress from the supply store in town. 2 days. Clara looked around the room. What do you sleep on until then? The couch. Ethan, it's your house, it's your room. He met her eyes without wavering. I told you. Your own room, your own space. I meant it. She looked at him for a long beat. 2 days, she said, and then I start earning my keep. You don't have to. For my own sake, not yours. She turned away from him and looked out the window at the dark pasture. Been idle a day in my life, Mr. Walker. You're not starting now. He left her to it. He built a fire in the kitchen, cooked the most reasonable meal he could manage from what was in the larder, and knocked on her door 30 minutes later. He said through the wood. A pause. Then, I'll be right there. They sat across from each other. At the kitchen table, a man who hadn't eaten a meal with another person in the better part of a year, and a woman who hadn't eaten a meal that wasn't wrapped in anxiety since her husband died, and they ate beans and cornbread in a silence that was, somehow, the most companionable silence Ethan had experienced in as long as he could remember. Bread is good, Clara said. My mother's recipe. She teach you to cook? She taught me everything worth knowing. He refilled his coffee cup. She died when I was 19. I'm sorry. She would have liked you, he said. He was immediately surprised that he'd said it, because he hadn't planned to, and because it was true in a way that seemed too soon to be true. He looked up from her plate. You don't know that. He had a gift for people who'd been through hard things and kept going anyway, he said. He would have liked you just fine. Clara set down her fork at the table. When she looked up again, something behind her eyes was working very hard to stay in check. It's going to be difficult, she said. Probably. I'm going to say things like that. And I'm going to have to keep reminding myself that this is temporary. It's the deal we made. Yes, she said, it is. They finished dinner. They washed up. They went to their separate rooms. The smaller one. With the single window that faced east, Ethan lay on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about what had happened in the last 24 hours. He'd won a card game. He'd refused an unconscionable prize. Proposed a practical arrangement to a stranger in a boarding house doorway. He'd gotten married, ridden home with a woman he didn't know, who had shaken his hand like she was closing a business deal, and said that maybe that's something we talk about later, while looking at his east pasture with the eyes of someone who understood land. He'd cooked her dinner. She'd said the cornbread was good. He told her his mother would have liked her, and she called him difficult. At the ceiling for a long time, he thought, I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. Underneath that, quieter and more surprising, I don't think I mind. Beside his window, the desert night pressed in, vast and patient, and full of the particular silence that comes just before the world shifts course. The stars above Arizona burned cold and indifferent. Inside the Walker Ranch, for the first time in years, there was a light in the kitchen window, and someone sleeping in the second room, and a man lying awake, not because he was lonely, but because he was thinking about East pastures, about horse breeding, about a woman who shook hands like she meant it, about the word temporary, And why already? Before the first night was even over, it had started to feel like the wrongest word he'd ever agreed to. The first week was the hardest. Not because they fought, because anything went wrong. Exactly. Because two people who had agreed to share a roof without sharing anything deeper had to learn the specific geometry of each other's silences, where to stand, when to speak, when to simply let the other person be. When Ethan left early, it was his rhythm. Zouts, when always had been up before first light, when coffee on the stove, the door, before the sky had finished deciding what color to be. He didn't change it for Clara's sake, because changing it would have felt like pressure, and he'd promised her no pressure. What he did do was leave the coffee hot every morning without announcing it, without making a thing of it. Just left the pot on the low heat with enough in it for 2 cups and went about his day. So, on the third morning, Clara came into the kitchen at sunrise and found the coffee waiting and stood there, looking at it for a moment longer than necessary. Evening at dinner, she said, without preamble. "Thank you for the coffee." "It's no trouble," he said. "It is, actually. Small troubles add up." He looked at her, over the rim of his own cup. "Not that one." He went quiet. In that particular way, she had not closed off, just processing, pulling things away behind those steady brown eyes. "You do that a lot," she said finally. "Say things simply. They're obvious, aren't they? Not to most people. People make things harder than they need to be," he said. Never seen the use in it. She looked at him a beat longer than usual. Then she went back to her dinner. But the next morning, when he came in from the early feeding, she had made eggs. Not just for herself. For 2, she didn't announce it either. Just set the plate down at his end of the table and sat down at hers and picked up her fork. Then sat down, started eating. "These are good," he said. "Your mother's recipe," she said, without looking up. Silence after that was different from the silence before. Warmer, like something that had been holding its breath had finally let it out. The first crack. By the end of the second week, she had taken apart the broken door and rehung it herself, borrowed Jorge's level and his patience and the better part of a Tuesday afternoon. He had watched her work with an expression that moved from polite skepticism to frank admiration over the course of about 40 minutes. "Mrs. Walker," he'd said, when she'd stepped back and tested the swing of the newly hung door. "Where'd you learn to do that?" "Husband was sick for 2 years before he died," she said simply. "Needed doing." Jorge had taken off his hat and held it in both hands, the way he did when he was moved, and didn't want to show it. "You'll do fine here," he said. "I intend to." Ethan had heard about the door from Billy Taft, who told it with the wide-eyed energy of someone who couldn't quite believe what he'd witnessed. Ethan had gone to look at the door himself, running one hand along the frame to check the hang. Better than he'd done it the first time. He didn't say anything to Clara about it that night. Still, he didn't need to. She caught him looking at the door when he passed it on his way in from the evening feeding, and she said from the porch where she was sitting, "Barn door was crooked. I've been meaning to fix it for a year. It's fixed now," he agreed. She turned back to the horizon, went inside, and that was all. And somehow it was enough. Was when things started to shift in ways that Ethan couldn't quite track or control. Clara had taken over the kitchen garden, what was left of it, which wasn't much, because Ethan had let it go to weeds and dry ground in the same slow, defeated way he'd let a lot of things go. She'd gone into town for seeds without asking his permission, which she didn't need, without telling him, which she equally didn't need to do. And when he'd come in one afternoon and found her elbow deep in a flower bed that had been dead ground that morning, he'd stood in the doorway for a solid minute without her noticing. She was talking to herself, low, running commentary, not words he could make out, just the rhythm of a woman working through a problem, out loud, in her own company. Hair was loose around her shoulders, and her hands were black with soil, and she had a streak of mud across her left cheek, and she was completely, absolutely, entirely in her element. Something happened in Ethan's chest that he firmly refused to name. He went back outside. That night at dinner, he said, "You went to the seed store. I'll pay you back for my wages." "You're not getting wages. We're on paper married," she said, lifting one finger from her fork to make the distinction. I want an accounting of what I contribute for my own records. It matters to me. She said it quietly but with absolute finality. 11 months, with my father treating every cent as a debt I owed him. I'm not going to spend the next year unable to account for my own worth. Please, he looked at her, at the quiet dignity behind what she was asking, and the old wound underneath it, the years of being turned into a ledger entry rather than a person. He said, we'll keep a fair record. Thank you. What it's worth, the garden was worth more than whatever you spent on seeds. It's not worth anything yet. Give it 6 weeks. I meant it was worth it to see something growing again. He said it quietly, looking at his plate, forgotten what that looked like. This time, the silence was long enough that he looked up. He was watching him with an expression he didn't know how to read yet. Layered, complicated, something moving carefully behind her eyes like a thought trying to decide whether to become words. She said, why have you been alone so long? Quiet for a beat. I built the ranch. That takes time. It's not what I asked. No, he agreed, it's not. He set his fork down. There's a woman. 7 years ago, Eleanor Marsh, going to get married. She decided she didn't want the ranch. Life decided that the day before the wedding, actually, which was fairly efficient timing on her part, didn't say anything. She let him have the space. That I just stopped expecting it. The other part, he picked up his fork again. I'm good at the work. Is honest. It does what you expect it to. People don't, she said. People don't, he confirmed. She said softly. They don't. And she went back to eating, but something about the set of her shoulders had changed, a degree of tension gone, like a door that had been almost closed, swinging open just a fraction more. He noticed. He always noticed with her. That was the problem. He was starting to notice everything. The 4th week brought the first real test. When as Bennett came to the ranch, he didn't write up himself. That would have required too much honesty for a man like Sliss. He sent his lawyer, a thin-faced man named Aldrich, who arrived in a rented buckboard with a leather satchel and the practiced smooth manner of someone who delivered uncomfortable news for a living. Clara was in the garden when the buckboard came down the drive. Dead. She stood up and watched it come without moving, and her expression went from open to iron in about 2 seconds flat. I'll handle it, she said, when Ethan came out of the barn. I'll handle it, he said. She looked at him sideways. You don't have to. He's testing the arrangement. That means he's testing both of us. Ethan kept walking. Handle it. Something moved across her face. She fell into step beside him, climbed down from the buckboard, and introduced himself with a handshake that he offered to Ethan and not to Clara, which told Ethan everything he needed to know about whose interest this man was here to represent. Mr. Walker, I represent Mr. Silas Bennett, whose concern is, whose concern it is, Ethan said. Say your piece. Opened his satchel. It is satchel. Mr. Bennett is challenging the validity of the marriage as it pertains to the debt transfer. Position is that the stakes in a poker game cannot legally constitute the transfer of a binding financial instrument, and therefore, the client read the document before he signed it. Clara said. She blinked. I beg your pardon? The debt transfer document. My father signed it before the poker game as a declared stake. He had it prepared in advance. She crossed her arms, which means his attorney, presumably you or someone in your office, drafted it, which means your own office certified its legality before it was placed on that table, which opened his mouth, closed it. Furthermore, Clara continued, the marriage was officiated by Judge Harold Ferris and filed in the county records the following morning. The client wishes to challenge a legally filed marriage on the grounds that it interferes with a debt he voluntarily transferred as a gambling stake. He is welcome to present that argument in court. She tilted her head. I look forward to watching a judge's face when he explains that. Silence. Aldrich looked at Ethan. Ethan said, you heard her. Snapped his satchel closed. Mr. Bennett will not be pleased, Clara said pleasantly. He won't. Good afternoon, mister. They watched the buckboard drive back down the road. Then Billy Taft, pretending to work on a fence, Post approximately 30 feet away and had heard every word said. Ma'am, it's the finest thing I have ever witnessed. Turned to look at him. You were eavesdropping. Without apology. She almost smiled, not quite. It was almost. She turned back toward the garden and walked away, and Ethan watched her go and thought, she's been preparing for that fight her entire life. He caught Jorge's eye across the yard. Jorge touched his hat brim. That's all. That was enough. It was the 5th week when Ethan made his first real mistake. A dramatic one. Nothing that could be pointed to as a clear transgression. The small thing, the kind of small thing that cracks a careful peace. He'd come in from a long day of fence, work hot and tired and short-tempered, and Clara had rearranged the kitchen while he was out. Not the whole kitchen, just the shelves above the stove, the ones where he'd kept his mother's cast iron pans in a particular order for the past 8 years. He came in, went for the largest pan on instinct, and grabbed something else entirely. The pans, Clara said from the doorway. The arrangement made more sense if you know where they were, he said. Too sharp. He heard it the moment the words were out. It went still. Not wounded, she wasn't a woman who wore wounds on her surface. But she went very still, the way a person goes still when they're recalculating. Put them back, she said. No. He set the pan down. Both hands flat on the counter. I'm sorry. Stopped. Started again. Long day. No excuse. Kitchen, she said. I should have asked. Kitchen. He turned around. I've been saying it wrong this whole time. My barn. Our kitchen. All of it. I shouldn't be making you feel like a guest in your own home. She looked at him for a long moment. Ethan, it's a paper home. Now, it's the only home either of us has, he said. It makes it real enough. She held his gaze, and then keep the pans where they are. I don't want you to adapt. I want you, he stopped. It almost used was stay, and he understood in the same instant it surfaced that it was already too late to pretend he didn't mean it. I want you to be comfortable, he finished, which was true, and was also only half of what he'd meant to say. Once. She nodded about the arrangement. We can decide together. Yeah, he said. Okay, she said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she turned and went back to whatever she'd been doing. And Ethan picked up the right pan and started on dinner. And the kitchen felt different for the rest of the night, charged with something that had almost been said and hadn't been, lightly against the air between them like weather coming in. Weeks after Clara arrived, she found the old mare. She'd been exercising Penny along the far eastern fence line when she spotted the animal barely standing. Ribs visible. One leg favoring. One's cast off, turned loose or escaped, and drifted onto Walker land. She brought it in herself. Ethan found her in the barn with both horses when he came in from the fields, crouched beside the injured leg, with her hands moving careful and sure, and Jorge standing nearby, holding a lantern with the expression of a man deeply impressed. He walked it in. From the east pasture, Jorge said quietly, talking to it the whole way. What's wrong with the leg? Ethan asked. Hoof. Early stage. Clara didn't look up. Been without proper feed for a while. But she's not broken. Come back. If someone works with her. Will she? No horses, said. There was something in her voice, then, not arrogance, but certainty, the specific confidence of a person on home ground. And I were going to breed them. I spent 3 years learning before. She stopped. I know horses. All right, Ethan said. And then, because it needed saying she's yours if you want her, finally looked up. You don't know her history. She came when you called. That's history enough. Long pause. Clara looked down at the mare's leg. Temporary, she said. So quietly he almost missed it. This is temporary. She wasn't talking about the horse. Ethan didn't respond. Reached down on the other side of the mare and helped hold the leg steady while Clara worked. In the warm lantern light, they stayed there in the warm lantern light for the better part of an hour. Ethan, not talking, working the way two people work when they've run out of words and what's left is just the thing they're doing together. His name, Clara decided, was Grace, because she needed some. Was when the ranch hands started treating Clara like she'd always been there. It happened the way it always happens with things that matter gradually, and then, all at once. Taft started going to her with questions first, before coming to Ethan, not because he was bypassing his boss, but because Clara usually had a faster answer, and he was 18 and practical. Crane, one who had said approximately 40 words to Ethan in 2 years of employment, one said 45 words to Clara in their first real conversation, which Jorge noted with visible satisfaction. He himself had taken to stopping by the kitchen garden. Every evening, on his way to the bunkhouse, not to help Clara didn't need help but to talk, the easy wandering talk of old friends, which they had somehow already become. Ethan noticed all of it. He cataloged it, the way he cataloged everything about her, without meaning to. Building up an internal record he hadn't asked to keep, the way she stood at the fence in the evenings, watching the horses. She listened when he talked about ranch business, not politely, the way someone listens when they're waiting for their turn to speak, but actually listened with her whole attention, and then said things that were useful. She'd started leaving the kitchen light on at night when he worked late, so he wouldn't come into a dark house. He hadn't mentioned that one. He wasn't sure he could without giving away more than he was ready to give. The conversation that broke something open came on a Wednesday evening in the 8th week, sitting on the porch after dinner with coffee cooling in their hands. The sun was going down and the desert was doing the thing it does at dusk, going from brutal to beautiful. In about 10 minutes, all golds and deep purples, and Clara said out of nowhere, "Father is going to try something else." "Probably," Ethan agreed. Doesn't accept things. He just repositions. She wrapped both hands around her mug to find a different angle. Something legal or something that looks legal. "I mean it, Ethan. He's not finished." "I know." He looked out at the horizon. "When he tries, we handle it. Like we handled Aldrich." She said the word carefully, like she was picking it up to examine it. "Keep saying that." "Because it's accurate. This arrangement has an end point," she said. "I know what we agreed to. Then you know that building a we has..." She stopped, the mug in her hands. "It makes it harder." "How?" She was quiet for long enough that he thought she wouldn't answer. "Then, Thomas and I, when he got sick, I kept thinking about how we'd built everything together. Small thing. The way we made coffee, the garden, the horses we were going to buy. And when he was gone, all of those small things became evidence." She paused. "That he'd been there. Evidence of what we'd lost. Small, ordinary thing." "Clara, I am not saying..." She stopped herself. Again. "I'm saying that small things accumulate. And I'm not sure I can do this and not..." She didn't finish. Ethan didn't push. He understood what she wasn't saying. Understood it because he was feeling the same thing from his side of it, the accumulated weight of 6 weeks of left hot coffee and fixed barn doors and kitchen arguments and shared lantern light in the barn, all of it, piling up to something that felt dangerously like permanence. He said, "Do you?" "Yes," she looked at him. "You know, we should probably be careful," he said. "Phil," she agreed. And then, almost immediately, the east pasture. He blinked at the shift. "What about it?" If we cleared the back section and put up a proper shelter, it could support 15 breeding mares comfortably, with Grace as the start of the stock." She was looking out at the pasture now, not at him, thinking about it. "The breed stock in this territory is poor. There's a real market for quality horses if someone develops it right." His voice came out slower than he intended. "We just said, we should be careful about building things." "Talking about the ranch," she said. "The business." She didn't answer that, because the horse plan is... He stopped, looked at the pasture, the project she was describing, the work it would take once, the months, the investment, the shared purpose of it. "That's not a short-term plan." "No," she said, "it's not. You know that." "I know that. Quiet, level. I also know that I haven't wanted anything in 11 months. Since Thomas, I haven't cared about a project, a future, anything." She finally looked at him. "And I care about this one." She wasn't only talking about the horses. Walker, who had survived loneliness by keeping himself very carefully behind his own walls, felt something in his chest shift with a weight and certainty that frightened him completely. "You need capital," he said, because he needed to say something practical before he said something he couldn't take back. "Some saved," she said, "from before. I didn't tell my father about all of it. For your future." "Maybe this is my future," she said, without drama, the way she said everything that mattered. One. He looked at her profile in the last of the evening light, the set of her chin, the steadiness of her gaze. The woman who had repaired his barn door and saved a starving mare and taken apart his father's lawyer with 3 sentences and cooked him eggs without announcing it and left the kitchen light on at night without explaining why. "We go to the bank together," he said. "We pitch it as a partnership. Equal footing." "Equal footing," she repeated. "That's not going to change anything," she said softly. "Between us." "No," he agreed. And they both sat there knowing it had already changed everything. The blow came in the 9th week, and it came fast and from a direction neither of them expected. Taft came back from town on a Friday afternoon with the mail and a face that said he was carrying news he didn't want to deliver. He found Ethan in the barn and held out an envelope without a word. Heavy paper. The return address was a law firm in Phoenix. Ethan opened it. He read it once. Read it again. Silas Bennett hadn't gone to a local lawyer this time. He'd gone to the territory's most prominent legal firm. They had filed a formal challenge to the marriage on grounds that the debt transfer at the poker table had been coerced, that Ethan Walker had forced Silas Bennett's hand by creating a situation in which transfer was the only alternative to violence. It was a lie, cleanly constructed, and it had the weight of a serious law firm behind it. And at the bottom of the document, in a note added in Aldrich's own handwriting, "Mr. Bennett is prepared to settle all outstanding debt and dissolve the arrangement quietly, provided Mrs. Bennett returns to his custody within 30 days. Not care, not home, custody." Ethan stood in the barn holding that paper for a long time. Then he folded it, put it in his chest pocket, same pocket where he'd kept the first document that first night, and walked to the house. Was in the kitchen. Clara was in the kitchen. She looked at his face when he came through the door and set down the wooden spoon she was holding. What happened? He gave her the letter. She read it, standing at the kitchen counter. He watched her face not for weakness, but because he'd learned that her face told the truth even when her voice didn't. And he needed to know how afraid she was. She wasn't afraid. She was furious. A cold, precise fury that showed in the set of her jaw, and the careful way she refolded the paper and set it down on the counter, like she was afraid of what her hands might do if they kept holding it. "Suddy," she said. "Yeah." He used that word deliberately. "I know, he's not trying to win in court," she said. "He knows he can't win in court. He's trying to wear us down. The fight expensive enough that we settle." "I know that too." "You're not settling." She said it without question, without looking at him for confirmation. Statement of fact. "We are not settling." "No," Ethan said. She looked at him then, and something in the way she looked at him, the specific quality of trust in it, the way it landed on him like weight, nearly undid him where he stood. "Phoenix," he said. "I'll find us a lawyer who—" "Go," she said. "Clara, we'll go." She said it the same way he said things, simply, like it was obvious, like there was no other possible answer. "Equal footing, remember?" He held her gaze. "Yeah," he said. "Equal footing." They left for Phoenix 2 days later, riding into whatever Silas Bennett had built against them side by side, which was, Ethan thought, the only way either of them had ever known how to face anything that mattered. The sun came up over the desert in front of them, and Claire rode with her chin level and her eyes forward. The ranch fell away behind them, and Ethan thought about temporary penance, and the specific weight of a word like "we" when it starts to mean something you weren't prepared for. He didn't say any of that. But he kept pace with her horse, and she kept pace with his, and the miles opened up ahead of them like something that had been waiting. When the ride to Phoenix took 2 days, stopped the first night at a roadside inn in a small town called Maricopa Wells. The innkeeper gave them 1 room without asking. And Clara took 1 look at the single bed and said, without missing a beat, "You take the floor." "I was going to," Ethan said. "I know," I just wanted to say it first. He almost smiled. She almost let him. Dinner. In the common room with their elbows on a rough table and the noise of other travelers around them. And for the first time since this arrangement had started, they were somewhere that nobody knew them. Ranch hands watching with careful eyes, no Silas Bennett sending lawyers up the drive, pressing in through the windows. Just two people eating a meal in a loud room. What you're thinking, Clara said. About the lawyer? About all of it. Ethan set down his fork. I'm thinking your father is a man who's never lost anything he decided to keep. And I'm thinking, he's decided to keep you not because he loves you, but because letting you go means admitting he lost. Yes, she said quietly. And that's exactly right. And I'm thinking the law firm he hired is expensive enough that this isn't about money for him. Ethan is personal. Everything with my father is personal. He just calls it business, so it sounds reasonable. How long has he been like this? She was quiet for a moment. My mother died. I was 12. Before that, he was not warm, but functional. He just became efficient. Like he decided that feelings were a liability and cut them loose. She looked at the table. Sometimes I think he looks at me and sees her, and he can't decide if he hates that or needs it. It's a hard thing to carry. It's harder being the thing he's carrying it onto. She looked up. I stopped being his daughter a long time ago, Ethan. Became a chess piece. I just refused to move the way he wanted. And Thomas saw me, simple, final. The way she talked about him, not with the raw grief of recent loss, but with the settled ache of something she'd already learned to live around. The first person who ever just saw me, as I was. He sounds like a good man. He was. She picked up her fork again. You would have liked him. I think I already do, Ethan said. Who made you feel safe, earns respect from me. He looked at him with those careful eyes, the ones that were always measuring, always cataloging. You do that too, she said. So quietly he almost lost it under the noise of the room. Make me feel safe. She said it like a confession she hadn't planned to make. Expect that. He didn't answer right away. Let it sit between them, because some things deserve space. Then, you make me feel like the ranch is worth something again, he said. He didn't expect that either. They finished dinner without talking much after that. Went back to the room, and Ethan settled on the floor with a folded blanket under his head. Clara said from the bed in the dark, Ethan, thank you for coming with me. You said equal footing. You know what I said? I'm saying thank you anyway. At the ceiling. Get some sleep, Clara. Pause. Then softer good night. Good night. In the dark, for a long time after her breathing evened out. Thinking about chess pieces and chess players and a man in Phoenix who thought he still had moves left. Bennett had no idea who he was playing against anymore. He found the lawyer the next afternoon. His name was Robert Hale, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a silver mustache and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen every kind of human mess and remained unimpressed by all of it. This was on the second floor of a building on Adams Street, and he read the legal challenge from Silas's firm without changing expression, turning each page with the same steady patience. When he finished, he set it down and looked at them both over his reading glasses. He said, That's the claim. It's false, Ethan said. Of course it is. Were there witnesses to the poker game? The entire saloon. Do you have names? Pete Calloway. The keep is a man named Greer. Half a dozen others. Them down. And the marriage certificate. With Judge Ferris the morning after. Good. He looked at Clara. Walker. Your father's firm is arguing that you were not a willing party to either the debt transfer or the marriage. They'll likely call you as a witness to your own reluctance. Reluctant, Clara said. Tell me specifically. Open the door, she said. I negotiated my own terms. He shook his hand and agreed. I rode to the ranch the next day on my own horse under my own power. I've been living there for 9 weeks by choice. And I have made improvements to the property and entered into joint business planning with my husband. She said the word without flinching. If my father's lawyers put me on a witness stand, I will say all of that under oath, and they will not enjoy it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Ethan. Did you find her? Poker game, Ethan said. He almost smiled. Right, he closed his notepad. Have this challenge dismissed within 60 days. Less. If Ferris will submit an affidavit about the filing, which I expect he will, the claim has no foundation, and their own document preparation undermines it. They can't argue the stake was illegal when their client's attorney drafted it. What does my father do next? Clara asked. Hale looked at her steadily. Men like your father don't stop, Mrs. Walker. They recalculate, try a different legal angle. He may try something less legal. He may decide the cost isn't worth it. A pause. Which of those happens depends somewhat on what you do next. You mean? He's trying to pull you back into his orbit. Challenge. Every legal letter, every lawyer he sends to your ranch, it's designed to keep you engaged with him. Bonding, reacting, spending energy on him. Hale leaned back. Ethan, the most effective thing you can do once this challenge is dismissed is build something visible and successful and entirely yours. Like Silas Bennett cannot stand being irrelevant. Make yourself irrelevant to him by becoming too large to fit in the box he built for you. Quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Ethan. He looked back at her. We're already working on that, he said. Rode home the next morning with Hale, engaged the legal challenge in competent hands, and something between them that hadn't been there before the trip, a weight, a shared thing, particular closeness that comes from standing together against something real. They didn't talk about it. They didn't need to yet. But on the long ride back, when the trail narrowed and their horses moved closer together by simple geography, neither of them pulled away. Dismissal came 43 days later. Hale sent the paperwork with a short note, challenge dismissed with prejudice. Firm withdrew before hearing. Suggest monitoring for further action, but doubt he'll try this particular avenue again. Well done. Ethan read it at the kitchen table while Clara was outside with the horses. He sat with it for a moment, the weight of it, the relief of it, and then he went to the door and called her name. She came in with Grace at her shoulder, the mare having developed the habit of following her around the yard like an oversized dog. Grandma read the note standing at the counter. Read it twice. She put it face down on the counter and pressed both palms flat on the surface and took one long breath. She said, Okay, he agreed. He's going to try something else. But not today, not today. She straightened. Zon's eyes were very bright, and she blinked once hard, then her face was its usual composed self. You want to go to the bank, she said. The horse operation. You want to start the paperwork. He looked at her. At the brightness still in her eyes, the steadiness of her jaw, the woman who had just won a legal battle against her own father, and was already thinking about the next move. He said, Let's do it. She nodded. And then before he could prepare for it, she crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, not a romantic embrace. The full-bodied hug of someone who has been holding themselves together under pressure and needs exactly 3 seconds to let someone else hold the weight. He put his arms around her without thinking. She pulled back after those 3 seconds. Exactly as promised, away, stepped and straightened her collar and said, "Your bank opens at 9, he said. She went back outside. Grace lifted her head and fell back into step behind her. Ethan stood in the kitchen for a moment, with his hands at his sides, and the feeling of those 3 seconds still warm across his chest. She doesn't know, he thought. She has no idea. He was completely in love with his paper wife, and it was the most inconvenient thing that had ever happened to him in a life that had contained considerable inconvenience. This operation took shape over the following weeks, with a speed that surprised both of them. They had a plan, not a vague plan, not a dream, but an actual written plan with numbers and timelines and sourcing contacts she'd been building in her head since she'd first stood on that rise looking down at the east pasture. Presented it to the bank with the directness of someone who knew exactly what she was asking for and exactly why they should say yes. And the bank manager, cautious man named Fitch, who had spent 20 years making cautious decisions, approved the loan in 4 days. He looked scared. Billy Taft reported to Jorge That evening, having happened to be in the bank at the time, he laid out those numbers and he looked like a man who realized arguing would be the wrong call. Jorge said. The first 5 mares arrived in October. Ella had sourced them herself, 2 from a rancher in New Mexico. From a breeder outside Flagstaff, the others through contacts Thomas had kept that she'd carried in a small notebook for 2 years. Waiting for a moment she hadn't been sure would come. Those horses, from sunrise to past dark. Not wildly, not recklessly, with the focused, efficient energy of someone doing the thing they were meant to do. Ethan watched her with those horses and understood something he hadn't been able to articulate before. This was who she was under the grief and the pressure and the survival. This was Clara Bennett on her own terms, in her own element. Devastating, in the best possible way. "You're staring," Jorge said quietly one afternoon, appearing at Ethan's shoulder while Ethan was watching Clara work a new mare in the round pen. Ethan said, "That's a kind word for it." But Jorge, "I've worked for you 7 years, Jorge said. I watched you turn away 3 women in that time because you were afraid the ranch life would drive them off like Eleanor Marsh did. You stopped trying." He paused. "That woman is not Eleanor Marsh. I know that. She's not going anywhere. She might." Ethan's jaw tightened. "We have an arrangement. It has an end point. The end point passed 6 weeks ago," Jorge said simply. "You has mentioned it." Ethan said nothing, because Jorge was right. The 1-year mark they'd discussed had come and gone without either of them raising it, with the deliberate mutual silence of 2 people who had both noticed and were both pretending they hadn't. Jorge said, "It's not that simple. It never is. Anyway." He walked away, and Ethan stood there, watching Clara move, with the mare patient, precise, utterly certain, and felt the words building in his chest like water behind a dam. He told himself, "Not yet." The twist came on a Thursday morning in November, and it came in the form of a man Ethan had never seen before. He arrived alone, He'd been riding a good horse, being a leather satchel, but unlike Aldrich, and wasn't a lawyer's errand runner. He was older, 60s maybe, with a careful face, and the clothes of someone from back east who dressed practically for the territory. He asked for Clara by her maiden name, Clara Bennett, he said. "Walker, now I understand." "Who's asking?" Ethan said. "Everyone. My name is Gerald Moss. I'm an attorney from St. Louis. I represent the estate of Thomas Allen Reeves." Ethan went still. Reeves was Clara's husband. "Yes." Moss looked at him steadily. "It's a matter of considerable importance that I need to discuss with Mrs. in person. Privately, if possible, though, given the circumstances, I understand if she wants you present." He came out of the barn. At that moment, Grace at her shoulder as always, wiping her hands on a cloth, at the stranger. The stranger looked at her, shifted in his expression recognition. Or something like it. "Mrs. Walker," he said, "I'm Gerald Moss. I was Thomas's family attorney in St. I've been looking for you for 8 months. It went very still. "Thomas didn't have family in St. No, but he had an insurance policy filed through a St. T firm. Moss opened his satchel. "Mrs. Walker, your husband took out a life insurance policy 4 years ago, before his illness. He named you as the sole beneficiary. The policy was written under his family name and filed in Missouri, which is why it didn't surface in the Arizona records when his estate was settled." Filled out the document. Clara didn't take it, not right away. She stood looking at it with an expression. Ethan couldn't fully read something between shock and something older than shock. That looked like the specific pain of hearing a dead man's name spoken by a stranger Tigger who knew something she didn't. "Much," she said. Not a question, the flat voice of someone bracing. $700, Moss said, after the firm's recovery fees. Interest accumulated since filing, closer to $5,200, landed in the air between them. $5,200. And heard Clara's breath change, just slightly. Just enough. She started. "The exact amount of your outstanding debt." Moss looked at her with something that was, underneath the professional manner, genuine compassion. The debt existed. He knew what your father had done with it. He took the policy out before he got sick, Mrs. Walker. Trying to make sure that no matter What happened? You'd be free. The cloth in Clara's hand fell to the ground. She didn't pick it up. Bennett. She stood there in the yard with the morning sun on her face and Grace pressing her nose gently against her shoulder. First time since Ethan had known her, since the boarding house door and the handshake and the long ride and all the weeks between Clara Bennett Walker's composure broke dramatically, not loudly. One, just her eyes filling fast, filling in her jaw, working against it. And one single breath that came out in pieces. She said, he knew. Moss confirmed gently. He didn't tell me. He said, and I have this in writing. In his letter of instruction, he had said that telling you would make you spend the money trying to save him instead of saving yourself. And he said. Moss paused, looking at the paper in his hands. Clara has spent enough of her life trying to keep things from falling apart. Let her spend the rest of it building something new. Made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh, and was entirely heartbreaking. She turned away, walked 3 paces, stopped. Her hand came up to her face. Ethan took 1 step toward her and then stopped because he didn't know if she wanted him there or needed the space, and he would rather die than get that wrong. Grace made the decision for him. The mayor turned from Clara's shoulder and looked at Ethan with those dark eyes. And stepped aside in a way that was so clearly an invitation that Jorge, who had appeared quietly in the barn doorway, later said he'd never quite believed horses could think until that moment. Ethan crossed the yard. He didn't say anything. He put 1 hand on Clara's shoulder. Just his hand. Steady and present, and stood there. He turned into him. Just slightly, just enough. He put his arm around her. He pressed her face against his shoulder for 30 seconds and let herself grieve the man who had loved her, enough to plan for her future even while dying. The years of debt and pressure and survival mode that was almost indistinguishable from pain. Then she straightened, stepped back, pressed her fingers under her eyes. Once. Mr. Moss, she said, and her voice was only slightly unsteady. I'll need the full documentation. Of course. And I want Thomas's letter. It's in the satchel. It's yours. She nodded. I'll sign whatever needs signing today. You stay for lunch? Yes, if it's not an imposition. She bent and picked up the cloth from the ground. Put it in her pocket. Come inside. She walked to the house. When Moss looked at Ethan. She's remarkable, he said quietly. Yes, Ethan, she is. He said it the way you say something you've known for a long time and are only just letting yourself say out loud. Noon passed. In the careful work of legal paperwork, documents signed, satchel, contents organized, everything witnessed and noted and filed. He worked through it with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything. And Moss had been doing this for 30 years, told Ethan privately before he left that Clara Walker was the most clear-headed client he had ever seen in the middle of an emotional situation. She's extraordinary, he said. I know, Ethan said. When Moss rode away, the yard was quiet. Clara was sitting on the porch step with Thomas's letter in her hand still folded, not yet read. He'd been holding it for 2 hours without opening it. Ethan came and sat beside her, not close, just present. Don't have to. He started. I know. She looked at the folded paper. I'm working up to it. Take all the time you need. Quiet for a moment. Then, you know what this means. He did know. He'd known the moment Moss had said the number. Financially independent. He said, you don't need the arrangement anymore. She said, I don't. The words sat between them with all their weight. He said carefully, what do you want to do? She looked at him then. Straight at him. The way she did when she meant something completely. What do you want me to do? She asked. That's not how this works, he said. Your choice, Ethan. Clara, I am asking you a direct question. Her voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. Something was moving in them, something she was keeping carefully in check. He looked at her. At the woman who had walked through his door as a stranger and repaired his barn and saved a starving horse and dismantled his loneliness so quietly he hadn't noticed until it was already gone. The woman who had stood in his kitchen and called him difficult and left the light on at night and held his arm around her for 30 seconds in the yard when the grief broke through. He thought about Jorge saying, "Tell her." He thought about the word temporary and how long ago it had stopped meaning anything. "I want you to stay," he said, "not because of the arrangement, because of the debt or the horses or the ranch. I want you to stay because—" He stopped. "I'm not good at this part. Anyway, because I love you." He said it the way he said everything plainly, without performance, looking right at her. "Then I have for a while. I don't know the exact moment it happened. Know that somewhere between the barn door and the morning coffee. And that first time, you looked at the east pasture like you could already see what it would become. I stopped wanting this to be temporary. You didn't say anything because the deal was yours to end. And I would rather have kept at the arrangement decent and kept you Kennemeller than said something and watched you ride away." Silence. Clara looked at him for a long, unreadable moment. "It's the most words I've ever heard you say at one time," she said. He said, "I know. You should have said something sooner." Something shifted in his chest. "Clara, I have been fighting this since the 5th week," she said. Not angry, not relieved. Just direct, in the way she was always direct when she'd made up her mind. Myself, it was temporary. I told myself I was being practical. Myself that what happened with Thomas had left me too fragile for something new. She looked at the folded letter in her hands. Thomas knew me well enough to know I'd try to argue myself out of being happy. In the instructions he left Moss. What did the instructions say? I read the letter yet. But Moss told me. She took a breath. He said, "Thomas said, if Clara has found someone, don't let her talk herself out of it. Try. She's very convincing. Don't let her." Ethan was quiet. He knew, Clara said, even at the end. He knew I would find my way to something good and then stand outside it arguing with myself. She looked up. He knew me better than I knew myself. "Sounds like he did," Ethan said softly. "I'm not using you as a replacement," she said. Her voice got very precise here. Deliberate. "I want you to understand that. What I feel, what I have been feeling for months, it's not about filling a space he left." Ethan said, "I know the difference." "You know." "Because you argue with me," he said. "You'd with Thomas too, I'm guessing. Not as a replacement as yourself. Same person. Still fighting for the same things." At him. "You're doing it again," she said. "What? Saying things like they're simple, aren't they?" He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. The real one, the rare one. He'd heard maybe 4 times in 3 months and had started to consider a personal achievement every time he earned it. "Yes," she said. "I suppose they are." She looked at the letter once more. Then she folded it again, smaller, and pressed it between both palms. "Staying," she said. "Not because I have to. Not because the horses are here, or the east pasture, or any of that." She met his eyes. "Because you made me feel like the kind of person who deserves to stay somewhere good. You haven't felt that since Thomas." Ethan reached out and took her hand, dramatically, not with ceremony. His hand, covering hers, where she held the letter, the last words of a good man who had loved her enough to set her free, and wise enough to know she'd need someone to catch her when she finally let herself fall. He said, "Okay," she said. They sat on that porch step in the late afternoon quiet, with Grace watching them from the yard and Jorge somewhere in the barn pretending he couldn't see anything. In the October light going gold over the east pasture that was already under Clara's hands, becoming something new. She said after a while, "The cornbread really is good." Deader. She looked back at him, and this time she let the smile come, the full one. Unguarded. The one that changed her entire face, and Ethan Walker, who had spent 10 years building walls. He wanted the last of them come down, so quietly. There wasn't even a sound. "Your mother's recipe," he said. "I know," she said. "You want to learn it. I'll teach you tomorrow." "Good." It's unfinished going down. They stayed where they were. And the paper marriage that had started in a boarding house doorway with a handshake and a list of terms, and the word temporary, that paper marriage, on a Thursday evening in November, became something that no document had ever been able to hold and no lawyer had ever been able to challenge. It became real. And in the morning, she read Thomas's letter. She read it alone. The room, the door closed. Everyone, and Ethan didn't ask what it said. He left the coffee hot and went out to the barn and gave her the time. When she came out 2 hours later, her eyes were red and her chin was steady, and she put the letter carefully in the cedar box she kept on her dresser, alongside the debt document and the marriage certificate, all three papers together, the whole architecture of how she'd gotten here. She came to find him in the barn. He said he hoped I'd found someone stubborn enough to deserve me, she said. Ethan looked up from the saddle he was working. He said, stubborn? He wasn't wrong. No, she said, he wasn't. She leaned against the stall door. So said, and I'm telling you this so you understand what you've gotten yourself into. He said, tell him the east pasture needs a good well if the horse operation is going to work, and make sure he digs it before winter. Ethan stared at her. He couldn't have known about the east pasture. He knew me. She smiled that real smile again, the one he'd decided was worth any amount of difficulty. He knew I'd find a ranch with a good east pasture eventually. Ethan set down the saddle. I'll start on the well Monday, he said. You will, she said. Send everyone. And she turned and walked back out into the yard. He fell into step behind her. And the morning light caught them both. Everyone. And Ethan Walker stood in the barn doorway watching his wife, his real wife, the one he'd won in a card game and chosen in a boarding house and fallen in love with over coffee and cornbread and a barn door walk across the yard she'd made her own, toward the horses she'd made thrive in the life she decided to keep. He thought about Silas Bennett somewhere in Tucson, recalculating his next move, about how Silas had sat across that poker table and called his daughter a liability. And he thought that there had never been a man so wrong about anything in the history of Arizona territory. He was never a liability. She was the whole hand. Ethan started on the well Monday, exactly as he'd said. He had learned by then that when Ethan Walker said he would do something, he did it not with fanfare, not with announcement with a steady, but with the certainty of a man who understood that the gap between words and action was where character actually lived. He said Monday. He started Monday. And Billy Taft worked alongside him. And Will Crane, who had said perhaps 60 words total in 3 years of employment, said 112 words over the course of that first digging day, which Jorge later recorded in his memory as a historical event, brought water out to them at noon, and stood at the edge of the dig, watching the progress. And Ethan looked up at her from 8 feet down with dirt on his face and said, Thomas was right about the location. Water table here. Don't tell me that, she said, believing he was always right about everything. And that's a very inconvenient thing to believe about a man who isn't here to argue with. I always, right? She considered it, about the important things. It was terrible with directions. I have excellent directions, Ethan said. I've noticed. She handed down the water canteen. That's either a point in your favor or proof that no one's perfect in the same ways. Handed it back up. I'll take either. Back to the house. And Billy Taft waited until she was inside, and then looked at Ethan with the unguarded admiration of an 18-year-old who has just witnessed something he can't quite name. Boss, he said. Drop it, Billy, Ethan said. I wasn't going to say anything. We're going to say something. I was going to say, she's good. For all of us. Billy looked at the house. It's different here now. Even the horses act different. Bond to their handler. Ethan said, I know. And she handles everything. Jorge, who was working the other side of the dig, said nothing. He simply smiled at the ground in front of him and kept digging. The well was finished by Wednesday. It was a good well, deep and clean, exactly where it needed to be for the east pasture operation. Tested the water herself, filled a bucket, and held it up to the light and said good, with the specific satisfaction of someone's checking off a line on an internal list that had been building for a long time. 3 more mares arrived from a breeder in New Mexico, a man named Sandoval, who Clara had written to 6 weeks earlier. He bred a line of working horses that combined endurance with temperament in a way that made them exceptional for the Arizona territory. Sandoval had written back within 10 days, which in Ethan's experience of breeders was nearly unheard of, and had agreed to her terms with minimal negotiation. You get him to agree so fast. Ethan asked when the horses arrived. I told him what I was building and why it would matter, Clara said, watching the mares come off the transport. Men who love horses respond to someone who understands what a good horse operation does for a community. It's not just business, it's legacy. Legacy, Ethan repeated. A horse can change a family's life, she said. Animal at the right moment. For a rancher, for a farmer, for a man trying to build something, it matters. Val knows that. He wanted his horses to go somewhere that understood it. Watched her move to the first mare, her hand extended, low and patient, letting the animal come to her rather than reaching. I've been doing this 10 years. 10 years ago, he said. Was doing other things 10 years ago, she said, without bitterness, when it's supposed to happen. He believed her. He was learning to believe most things she said because she had a precision with words that meant she didn't spend them carelessly. November turned to December. Everyone brought the first real test of their actual marriage, not the paper one, not the legal arrangement one, conscious one, the daily ongoing negotiation of two strong-willed people, sharing a life they'd both built separately and were now trying to build together. The first argument was about money, not the horse operation money that was Clara's, and they'd agreed on it, and it was running well and producing results that were already drawing attention from ranchers as far as Flagstaff. Argument was about the house repairs. Ethan had priced out the work. New roof section on the east wing, repaired. Porch paint, and had done it without mentioning it to Clara first, because in his mind the house was his primary responsibility, and the ranch finances were his domain. He found the estimate on the kitchen table and read it, and said, very quietly, "When did you plan on telling me about this?" "Routine maintenance," he said. "I handle the structural." "Handle things," she said. Same word she'd used in Phoenix. Same tone. Except this time there was an edge under it, not anger, but something close. Did that only apply when it was convenient? "Clara, your wife, Ethan. Your actual wife, not your paper one. I am part of decisions about this house that I live in, that I have repaired and planted and cooked in," and she stopped, pressed her lips together, recalibrated. "I am not asking to control the finances. I am asking to be included in the conversation." He looked at her, underneath the edge, not just irritation at being left out, but something older. Years of being treated as a piece in someone else's plan, rather than a person with a stake in the outcome. Done, without meaning to, a version of what Silas Bennett had always done. Made a decision about her life without asking. "You're right," he said. He blinked. She'd been prepared for an argument. He said again, "I should have brought it to you first." Habit. "The ranch was mine alone for a long time, and it was wrong." "I'm sorry." The edge went out of her posture. "Not completely, but enough." "Do it again," she said. "I won't. I mean it." She picked up the estimate, looked at it. Porch needs more than they've quoted. The northeast post is rotted through, and they've priced it as cosmetic repair. I was going to push back on that, push back harder. And the paint, there's a supplier in Tucson who does better quality for less. He knows him. I'll talk to Jorge. We'll talk to Jorge, she said. Almost smiled. We'll talk to Jorge. She put the estimate back on the table. Making coffee, she said. Sit down. We'll go through the whole thing. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours, going through the estimate line by line. And it was the most productive and intermittently heated conversation Ethan had had about roofing in his entire life. And he went to bed that night feeling, strangely, more married than he had since the ceremony, because real marriage, he was discovering, was not the warm parts only. It was also the friction parts, the parts where two people who each have a clear sense of what's right bump up against each other and have to decide whether to retreat or figure it out. Figured it out. Every time they figured it out, came quietly. He didn't make a production of it. Neither of them were people who needed production. But Clara had strung something green along the porch railing, and Ethan had found in the supply store in town a small painted figure of a horse that looked startlingly like Grace, and set it on the kitchen windowsill. without comment on Christmas morning. Found it when she came in for coffee. She stood looking at it for a long moment. Ethan. He was already at the table with his cup. It looked like her. I thought you'd want it. She picked it up, turned it in her hands, set it back down facing the window. You, she said. Soft, genuine. Merry Christmas, he said. He turned around and crossed the kitchen, and kissed, not the restrained kiss of two people, illicit negotiating their terms. One, some with her hands on his face, and her whole intention behind it, a kind of kiss that said, I choose this as clearly as any words. She stepped back. When she stepped back, he said, I should have gotten you something better. You got me exactly the right thing, she said. You almost always do. Almost? You occasionally leave your boots in the middle of the hallway. It's not a gift problem. That's a character flaw. She agreed pleasantly. It is. Her coffee and sat down across from him. And they had Christmas morning, the way they had most mornings, now comfortable, honest, full of the specific warmth of two people who have stopped performing for each other and started simply being. Ethan thought, the best Christmas he'd had since his mother was alive. January brought the drought warning. It came through the county. Notice a dry winter projected to extend through spring, with water restrictions likely by March. A horse operation that had just expanded to 14 mares and was planning its first breeding season. It was a serious problem. Heard the news in town on a Tuesday and came home fast. And Ethan knew something was wrong before she was off her horse because her jaw was set at the angle it got when she was working through a problem that didn't have an obvious solution. Well, she said, before she was through the door, I heard, we need a secondary water source on the south boundary. Runs dry by June in a normal year. What about the Henderson's water rights on the north side? They're not running cattle anymore. He looked at her. How did you know about the Henderson water rights? Kay mentioned they'd let their cattle operation go last fall. I asked him about the property. She pulled off her riding gloves. They'd consider leasing the water access. Clara, known Jim Henderson for 15 years, and he's never leased anything to anyone. Been asked by someone with a specific offer and a clear plan, she said. Tried? No, he admitted. Then we haven't failed yet. She hung her coat. We'll go see him Thursday. We'll go, he said. She turned and looked at him, and the corner of her mouth moved. It still wasn't a woman who smiled easily. That was one of the things he'd learned to love most when she did smile. It meant something, she agreed. Jim Henderson was a weathered, taciturn man in his 70s who had been a rancher longer than Ethan had been alive and who greeted visitors with approximately the same warmth as a fence post. Listen to Clara's proposal, precise, fair, one with specific numbers and a clear timeline from behind a coffee cup he never put down, one, and said nothing for long enough that Billy Taft heard the story secondhand from Jorge. It was the most tension he'd ever imagined from a water rights negotiation. Then Henderson said, I heard about your horse operation. Clara said, I heard you brought in Sandoval's stock. His line. Yes. Henderson looked at her over the coffee cup. Your granddaughter wants a horse. Good one. Something she can train. It met his eyes. If you give us water access through the drought, when our first breeding season produces, you have first right of refusal on any foal you want. It might cost, not market price. Henderson put the coffee cup down. He said. Ethan had been in that room and still wasn't entirely sure how it had happened. When on the ride home, he said, you offered him a foal before we've had a single breeding season. Breeding season will work, she said. Sandoval's line crossed with the two Flagstaff mares. The genetics are right. Been watching the animals for 3 months. It'll work. It doesn't? Then I buy Henderson's granddaughter a horse from Sandoval at my own expense, and we find a different solution. She looked at him. Promises I can't keep. Ethan. I made a promise I was 90% sure I could keep and accepted 10% personal risk. Seemed like fair odds. He shook his head slowly. You are something else entirely, he said. Is that a complaint? Not even slightly. Where he brought the cold and the quiet and the long, dark evenings that they filled without planning it, without any moment of decision, with a life that looked from the outside, it went like something that had always been there. Yeah, reading at the kitchen table while Ethan worked on accounts. Ethan coming in from the barn to find dinner already made, not because it was her job, but because she'd finished her work first and made it as a simple, practical act of care. Waking in the night to a horse that was restless. Because she always heard them. She had some frequency of attention tuned to those animals that never fully switched off. And Ethan getting up too, because she needed him, but because he was awake anyway, and the cold walk to the barn was more bearable with company. All small things. Thomas had been right about that too. The twist that March brought was not the drought. It was Silas Bennett, not a lawyer this time, not a legal document, himself, riding up the drive on a gray morning with one hired man behind him, and a particular expression of a man who has decided that the indirect approach has failed and it's time to come in person. Saw him from the barn before he reached the house. She stood in the barn doorway and watched him come, and her face did something Ethan had never seen it do before. It went completely, carefully blank, composed, not coast, blank, the specific blankness of a person shutting down, feeling to survive a confrontation. Inside, she said. Ethan, who had come up beside her, said no. His voice was quiet and completely final, equal footing. She looked at him. That blank thing cracked slightly. Slightly. She nodded once. They walked out together. Liz reigned in 10 feet from them. He looked older than Ethan remembered from the saloon, or maybe just smaller, the way people sometimes shrink when you see them outside the context of their own power. He looked at Ethan first, then at Clara, and something moved behind his eyes that Ethan couldn't name. He said, "Father," she said, "nothing else. I am well." A pause. When Silas's eyes moved around the yard, the well, mares, visible in the east pasture, repaired barn, and the freshly painted house. Inventory, the way he always did, because a man like Silas Bennett looked at everything and asked what it was worth and who owned it. "We built something here," he said. "We have," Clara said. His eyes came back to her. "I want to talk to you." "No," she said. He blinked. "Clara, whatever you have to say it here. Ethan is my husband. There's nothing you'd say to me that he shouldn't hear." His jaw tightened. Then he looked at Ethan, a direct, assessing look, the kind he'd probably used his whole life to measure men and find them wanting. Ethan met it without moving. "You've done well by her," Silas said finally, like the words cost him something. "She's done well," Ethan said. He tried to keep up. Something flickered on Silas's face. He came to. He stopped, started again. "The legal challenges are finished." Instructed the firm to close the file. Clara said nothing. "Made mistakes," Silas said. The words were flat and unpracticed. The words of a man who had said them almost never and was finding the shape of them difficult. "The debt. With the game. I thought," he pressed his lips together, "was solving a problem. I thought I was solving a problem. What the problem was," Sinclair said. "You were. He paused. "I'd like to not be finished with you. If that's possible." The yard was very quiet. Clara looked at her father for a long moment, at the man who had turned her into a ledger entry, who had sold her in a card game, who had sent lawyers and challenges and a hired rider to chase them down on a desert road. She looked at him with those clear, honest eyes and did the thing she always did, assessed, cataloged, decided. "I don't trust you," she said. "I know I may never trust you. You should understand that. I do. And any relationship we have from here will be on my terms. Mine and Ethan's, not yours." Silas looked at Ethan. Ethan said nothing. This was Clara's, and he would not take it from her even by speaking. Silas said, "Then you can come to dinner," Clara said. "Today we eat at 6. Silas nodded once. He looked at Friedman. In that moment, a man carrying something he'd been carrying for a long time and had just been told he could set it down, and wasn't quite sure how. His horse rode back down the drive. When he was gone, Billy Taft materialized from behind the barn with the expression of a man who had witnessed something biblical. "Don't," Clara said. "I was just going to say that was the bravest." She turned and walked to the barn. He disappeared at the door, as if on cue. And Clara put her face against the mare's neck, and Ethan watched her stand there for a moment, not crying, just breathing the way you breathe after something that cost you more than you wanted to show. He went to her, put his hand on her back, said nothing. For a moment, she lifted her head. "Sunday dinner," she said. "I'll make the cornbread," he said. She almost laughed. It came out as something close to it. "Ethan, for not stepping in. It was yours." "It was mine," she agreed. "It helped. You being here." "Always," he said. She nodded once, straightened, went back to work. That was March. It was when the first foal was born. It came in the early hours of dawn. Before the way most things that matter seemed to come without announcement. It said, "It's still dark," while the world was still dark, and only the people who were paying attention were awake to see it. Clara had been in the barn every night that week, sleeping in 2-hour shifts because she'd known this mare was close and she didn't leave things to chance. Had been doing the same without discussing it, just appearing in the barn when her shift ended, because that was how they were now. The kind of partners who show up without being asked. He was there when it happened. A filly dark brown with one white stocking, from Sandoval's line crossed with the Flagstaff mare. Exactly as Clara had projected, and healthy and furious about being in the world, fighting her way to standing with the particular indignant energy of something that has arrived and intends to stay. Sat back on her heels and watched the filly find her legs. Her face in the lantern light was something. Ethan didn't have words for not just joy, not just relief, but a kind of completion. A circle closing, Thomas's voice in a letter and a well dug on his instruction, and a breeding plan built from 3 years of study, finally made real in a cold April barn. Clara said. "She is," Ethan agreed. Letter said. She stopped, tried again. He said he hoped I'd build something that lasted. Living. "You have," Ethan said. She looked up at him, were bright in the lantern light. "We have," she said, down, and took her hand where it rested on her knee, and she turned her palm up and held his back. And they sat in the warm barn, watching the filly learn to stand, the two of them, and the new life between them, and the particular silence of people who have come through enough together to stop needing to fill every moment with words. Filly's name, Clara decided by morning, was Promise, because that was what she was. The drought broke in May. It never came, all at once, but in stages. The sky softening and the creek beginning to run again, and the pasture going from the dusty gold of endurance to the tentative green of recovery. Kept his side of the agreement through the dry months without complaint or renegotiation. And Clara bought his granddaughter a horse anyway, a young mare from Sandoval's second delivery, gentle and smart, Betty, halter trained, and came to pick up the horse personally. He was in the yard looking at it for a moment. There stood in the yard this tough old man who had ranched through droughts and downturns and 30 years of Arizona territory hardship. And then he looked at Clara and said, "My granddaughter's going to love this animal. Work with her every day," Clara said. "Consistency is what builds trust." And looked at Ethan. "Smart woman," he said. "Smartest person I know," Ethan said. Clara gave him a sideways look. "Don't make me insufferable." "Too late," Henderson said dryly. A man of 68 words per year. It was practically a speech. The summer brought 3 more foals, 2 new ranch hands, reputation that had spread far enough that a buyer came from as far as California, a man named Whitmore, who'd heard about the Walker operation from Sandoval Homes, with a letter of introduction and a serious budget, and left with 2 mares and a promise of first right on the next breeding season's best filly, and handled the negotiation. Clara let him, not because she couldn't, but because she was building the breeding program and couldn't step away from the mares, and because they'd learned the particular efficiency of 2 people who trust each other enough to divide the work without losing equal ground. Whitmore left. Ethan came to find her in the east pasture and said he paid 30% over asking. He looked up from the mare she was working. "I know. Stock is worth it." He didn't even negotiate. Good buyers recognize value. Negotiating down good stock is how you lose access to good stock. She went back to the mare. Which over did he go? Ethan told her. She was quiet for a beat. Then put it toward the north pasture fence. The whole section needs replacing before fall. Thinking the same thing. I know, she said. Those hippies. We usually are. He stood there for a moment, watching her work, this woman who had walked through his door as a stranger and dismantled his loneliness and built something on his land that was better than anything he'd managed alone. About how 9 months ago, he'd sat in a saloon and won a card game, and the prize had turned out to be his entire life. He said, I've been thinking about the original one. She stopped what she was doing, slowly to look at him. Her face was careful. About it. We never formally ended it, he said. For marriage, gone. We never filed for the annulment. She said, we didn't. I want to make sure that's a decision, he said. Just something that got overlooked in the drought and the foaling season and the Henderson water rights and the California buyer and everything else. You want to make sure you chose this consciously, not by default. She looked at him for a long moment. Ethan Walker, she said. Walker, he said. I chose this the day I told Moss I was staying. I choose it every morning when I get up and make coffee for 2. Choose it. Every time you leave your boots in the hallway, and I don't move them because they mean you're home. She held his gaze. Chose you. Consciously, deliberately, and without reservation. Clear? Clear, he said. Good. She turned back to the mare. Stop interrupting my work. Yes, ma'am, he said. He was almost back to the barn when she called after him. Ethan, he turned. I love you too, she said. I don't think I said it plainly enough before. Plainly. He stood there in the summer light with his hat in his hand. He said, don't thank me. It's a fact, not a favor. He put his hat back on. Yes, ma'am, he said again, and went back to work. The fall brought Silas Bennett to Sunday dinner for the 3rd time. It was never comfortable, those dinners. Silas was a man who had spent 60 years being the most powerful person in any room, and the Walker kitchen was a room where that was simply not true, and the adjustment cost him visibly. He came. Every Sunday Clara invited him, he came. He sat at the kitchen table where Clara had first negotiated her terms in a boarding house doorway and now negotiated her own life again. And he ate Ethan's cornbread and Clara's roasted chicken gradually. Some or weeks and months to seem like less of a chess player and more of an old man who had made catastrophic mistakes and was trying, in the only way he knew, to find his way back to something he traded away. Ethan never fully trusted him. He didn't think he needed to manage that relationship with the same clear-eyed precision she managed everything else, not forgiving what didn't deserve forgiveness, not withholding what might one day be possible, the distance, keeping this kept safe without closing the door entirely. One evening, in October, almost exactly a year after Moss had ridden up the drive with his leather satchel, and Thomas's letter, Silas sat at the table after dinner, sipping his coffee, long after the meal was done, and said, listen, to no one in particular, the Walker operation placed at the Territory Horse Fair. And 3rd in the working class, Clara said, reserve champion. In the breeding category. Silas looked at his coffee cup. Your mother would have. He stopped. He loved horses. A silence, long and complicated. Clara said, I remember. She would have liked this place, Silas said, that you've built here. She would have helped build it, Clara said. She'd had the chance. Silas nodded slowly. The old machinery behind his eyes was doing something different than calculating. Yes, he said, she would have. He left an hour later, and Clara stood on the porch watching him ride down the drive, and Ethan came to stand beside her the way he always did. You all right? He asked. I don't know yet, she said honestly. It's me in a month. I'll ask you every month until you know. It'll take years, probably. I have years, he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, just briefly, for a moment. So do I, she said. They stood on the porch of the house that had started as his and become theirs, and the fall night pressed in around them with the smell of the desert and the distant sound of the horses in the east pasture. And Ethan thought about a dusty saloon in Tucson, and a hand of cards and a folded paper document that had seemed in the moment like the end of something. It had been the beginning of everything. And somewhere in the East pasture, really named Promise moved in the dark, strong and growing, and entirely and completely real and proof that sometimes the things built from the hardest circumstances turn out to be the most solid things of all. Have a way of moving differently once you stop counting them as survival. Years at the Walker Ranch had been counted in weeks, in drought warnings and legal challenges and foaling seasons and Sunday dinners with a man who was slowly, painfully learning to be something other than a chess player. Every week had weight. Every week had a problem to solve or a thing to prove or a wall to get through. Then somewhere in the middle of it all, the counting changed. Ethan noticed it first. He noticed it the way he noticed most things about their life, quietly, without announcing it, filing it away as evidence of something real. He stopped counting weeks and started counting seasons. And then he stopped counting seasons and just lived inside them. You live when you've stopped waiting for things to fall apart. First child came in the third year. A boy, dark-haired, loud, furious about being cold. Clara's son in temperament from the first breath. Ethan's in the stubborn set of his jaw from the first week. He named him Thomas Ethan Walker, and Clara held him in the bedroom where she'd once slept alone and told herself this was temporary. Ethan, and looked at Ethan over the baby's head with an expression he had never seen on her face before, open, completely without armor, and said, "He looks like he already has opinions." "Your son," Ethan said. "Of course he does." She laughed. A laugh, full and unrestrained. The one he'd been earning piece by piece for 3 years and still felt like a gift every single time. "It's very diplomatic of you," she said. "I'm a diplomatic man." "You are the least diplomatic man I have ever met," she said. "Exactly what you think, always, and you love that about me." He looked at him. "Yes," she said simply, "I do." Thomas Ethan Walker was from his first month a person with an agenda. He wanted to be outside. He wanted to be near the horses. He wanted to be wherever Clara or Ethan was, and he communicated his dissatisfaction with any other arrangement at considerable volume. Who had waited 3 years for this development with the patient certainty of a man who had seen the whole story coming from the first night, the baby on his first day in the barn, and said, "A horseman." "Tell his mother that yet," Ethan said. "She'll start training him before he can walk." Talking to him about the breeding program. Jorge said, "Her this morning." "Of course she is," Ethan said, and felt the specific warmth of a man whose life has exceeded every expectation he'd given up on. The child came 18 months later. A girl lighter than Thomas, quieter, with Clara's dark eyes and Ethan's unhurried way of observing the world before deciding to act. They named her May after Ethan's mother. And Clara insisted on it so firmly, early in the Q&A for Ethan understood it was something she'd been thinking about for a long time and simply waited for the right moment to say. "Didn't have to." He started. "I want to," she said. "Your mother gave you everything worth knowing. The least I can do is give her name to someone who'll carry it forward." He had to leave the room for a moment after that. He stood in the hallway outside with his hand on the wall and thought about a woman who died when he was 19 and never got to see any of this. The ranch that had become something, the woman he'd found in a boarding house doorway, who were going to grow up knowing that kindness was strength and not weakness. Tick. He stood there long enough that Clara called out from the bedroom, "Ethan, crying in the hallway?" "No," he said, a pause. "Right, if you are. I'm not." "Okay." And then gently, "Come back in. He wants to meet her father properly." He went back in. Walker turned out to be the kind of child who listened to everything and said little and understood more than anyone expected. By the time she was 3, she was following Clara around the east pasture with a focus that made the ranch hands trade looks. By the time she was 5, she was asking questions about bloodlines that made Clara stop what she was doing and answer them fully the way she answered anyone who asked a real question. Thomas, by contrast, everywhere at once and loud about all of it. He had Jorge's laugh and Clara's stubbornness and Ethan's bone-deep love of the land, and he burned through each day like it owed him something and he intended to collect. Those Keaton. They were. Those two children, the complete and perfect argument against the idea that a marriage built on desperation couldn't become something extraordinary. It was in the 7th year that Billy Taft got married. One. He'd been courting a school teacher named Rose from the town of Maricopa Wells for the better part of 2 years, with the anxious, hopeful energy of a young man who has decided on a person and is working ain't umped up the nerve to say so clearly. He came to Ethan. First stood in the barn with his hat in his hands, 25 years old, and terrified, and said, "We want to ask Rose to marry me." He wanted to, I don't know. I wanted to ask if you had advice. Then thought about it for a moment. "Tell her the truth," he said. "You actually feel. Not what sounds right. The actual truth. If the truth isn't eloquent enough." "The truth never needs to be eloquent," Ethan said. "It just needs to be real." Billy nodded slowly. "Is that what you did with Mrs.? I told her I loved her standing in a pasture with dirt on my boots," Ethan said. "Didn't plan it. It just came out because it was true." "And that worked? She's still here," Ethan said. Billy got married in October. Bella made the cake 3 layers. More ambitious than anything she'd attempted before, which meant she was up at 4 in the morning for 2 days running, which meant Ethan was up with her making coffee. It meant they spent 2 pre-dawn mornings sitting at the kitchen table while the cake layers cooled, talking in the easy, ranging way of people who have run out of things to hide from each other. "Going to ruin the boy," Ethan said on the 2nd morning. "I'm going to give him a beautiful cake," Clara said. "There's a difference. He's going to expect this standard from Rose. Is a school teacher. She's smarter than Billy, and she's known him for 2 years. She knows exactly what she's getting into. You did. Like you did?" She looked at him across the kitchen table at 4 in the morning with flour on her sleeve and her hair loose around her shoulders. "You had no idea what I was getting into," she said. "I was signing a temporary arrangement with a practical stranger. And instead I got a man who leaves his boots in the hallway and digs wells on a dead man's instruction and gets up at 4 in the morning to keep me company while I make wedding cake." She held his gaze. "The better end of this deal, Ethan. I want you to know I know that. You won a card game," he said. "And it turned out the prize was my entire life." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. She said, "It did." They stayed like that for a while, in the warm kitchen, while the cake cooled and the desert dark pressed against the windows, and the children slept in their rooms down the hall. Horses moved quietly in the east pasture, where a well had been dug on the instruction of a good man who'd known his wife better than she knew herself. The twist of 10th year came not from outside, not from drought or legal challenge or father recalculating his moves, but from within, the way the hardest things usually do. Ethan got sick, not the slow, consuming illness that had taken Thomas Reeves. Fast and vicious, that came in January and laid him flat in 3 days and frightened the ranch hands into silence, and Clara into the specific focused terror of a woman who has lost someone before and knows exactly what that fear tastes like. She didn't leave his side. She didn't panic either, or if she did, she contained it somewhere deep and private and ran the ranch and managed the horses and kept the household functioning and sat at his bedside every night with the same steady presence she brought to everything. Ethan, burning with fever and barely coherent for the first 4 days, was aware of her as a constant, her voice, her hand on his forehead, the sound of her moving around the room. On the 5th day, the fever broke in his eyes to find her asleep in the chair, fully dressed. It's on. Boots, one hand still resting on the edge of the bed near his arm, if she'd fallen asleep, mid-vigil, and her body had refused to fully let go of the watch. He lay there looking at her for a long time. He thought about boarding house doorways and card games and the word temporary and everything that word had failed to contain. He thought about Thomas Reeves, who had loved this woman enough to die, making sure she'd be free. He thought about what it meant, that she was here asleep in that chair, boots on, hand reaching toward him even in sleep. He said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. She was awake instantly, not the slow surfacing of deep sleep, but the immediate alertness of someone who had never fully gone under. She leaned forward, her hand moving to his face. Feel like I lost an argument with a fever, he said. You almost lost more than that, she said. Her voice was steady, but her hand wasn't. Not quite, he said. I know. She pulled her hand back, stood flat on her own knee. You scared me. I know. Do it again. I'll try, he said. Can't make promises about fevers. Them anyway, she said. I'm not, she stopped. I'm not doing this again. Being on this side of it, he said gently. He reached out and found her hand where it rested on her knee. You know what this cost you. She looked at him with those clear, honest eyes. You're not allowed to leave before me, she said. When I'm making that a rule. That's not how it works. You're making it a rule anyway. He held her hand. Clara, I love you, I know, she said. I love you too. Some water and stop being dramatic. He drank the water. He stopped being dramatic. He was back on his feet in 10 days, thinner and slower than before, but entirely himself. The first thing he did when he walked out to the east pasture, leaning on a fence post because his legs still didn't fully trust themselves, was look at what they'd built. 15 mares, 3 foals from this year's season. Well, that ran clean, fencing that held. A breeding operation with a reputation that had spread across 3 territories beyond the pasture. The house with paint that wasn't peeling, and a porch that was solid, and a kitchen where 2 people had learned each other over years of morning coffee and occasional arguments and the accumulated weight of 10,000 small, ordinary, irreplaceable days. Thomas was 9 years old and came to stand beside him at the fence with the self-possessed ease of a child who has grown up watching adults work hard and take things seriously. He looked at the pasture and then looked at his father and said, Jorge says you scared everybody. He talks too much, Ethan said. Jorge says that's rich coming from you, getting a pay cut. Thomas considered this. Your mama didn't sleep for 4 days. Ethan looked at him. She didn't say she was scared. She just worked and checked on you and then worked some more. Thomas squinted at the pasture. What love looks like. When it's real, Ethan looked at his son, this 9-year-old who had Clara's directness and her habit of asking the thing people were thinking but not saying. He said, that's exactly what it looks like. Like in songs. Songs are nice, but real love shows up and works and stays. When it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Thomas absorbed this with the seriousness of a boy storing information he intends to use, he said, and went back to the barn. Ethan stood at the fence a little longer. He thought about what he just said, about showing up and working and staying, about the specific weight of especially when it's hard. He thought about a poker table and a folded document and a boarding house door open 4 inches, about eggs made for 2 without announcement, and a barn door rehung with borrowed tools, and a woman who'd said this is temporary while looking at a pasture she was already planning to transform. He thought about Gerald Moss and a dead man's letter and a filly named Promise, about Phoenix and drought and water rights and a gray-haired man arriving at a ranch with nothing enough left but the word sorry and enough pride left to make it cost him. About Clara asleep in a chair with her boots on and her hand toward him. Reaching for men who go through their whole lives looking for the moment that will define them, the heroic act, the grand gesture, the thing they'll be remembered for. Ethan Walker had never been that kind of man. He always just tried to do the next right thing plainly, without drama, one, and let the accumulation speak for itself. But standing at that fence in the January light, 10 years after a card game that was supposed to be about money and turned out to be about everything he understood, that the moment had come and gone so quietly, he'd almost missed it. It had been a boarding house doorway at midnight. It had been a handshake, firm and serious, between 2 people who were terrified and trying not to show it. The word deal came out of the house. At that moment, pulling on her coat, he's falling in step beside her, the way she had for 10 years slower now, older but faithful as the sun. She crossed the yard and came to stand at the fence beside him. And she looked at the pasture the way she always did, assessing, planning the wheel, always turning. Shouldn't be out here yet, she said. I'm fine. Delirious 4 days ago. I'm fine now. She looked at him sideways. Stubborn. You knew that when you shook my hand. It was a feature, she said. Some days it's less clear. Out. And put his arm around her shoulders. One. She leaned into him, that particular lean she had. Comfortable and certain. The lean of a woman who has decided she belongs somewhere and has stopped second-guessing it. Promises Philly is going to be exceptional, she said, looking at the pasture. The coloring alone and the bone structure. What? Stop working for 5 minutes. She was quiet for a beat. It's rich coming from you. I'm convalescing. I get to say ironic things. She almost smiled. Then she did smile, the full one, the one. Zast, the one that had taken months to earn the first time. And now came easier, carelessly. So, minutes, she said. Then I need to check the north pasture fence. Minutes, he agreed. They stood at the fence together in the January quiet, moved along the rail beside them, unhurried. Pasture. The mares moved through the cold morning with the easy grace of that are well-tended and know it. And inside the house behind them, May Walker was explaining something at length to her brother Thomas in the specific tone of a 7-year-old who has decided she is correct and is prepared to defend that position indefinitely. The sound of it, the ordinary, replaceable sound of children arguing in a warm house on a cold morning, came through the kitchen window and settled over Ethan like something he would have given everything to hold on to if he'd known a decade ago that it was possible. Known. That was the thing about the life you were meant for. You couldn't plan for it. You couldn't see it coming. You couldn't only do the next right thing and trust that right things accumulate in the direction of something worth having. Refused to treat a stranger like property. He had walked out of a saloon and knocked on a boarding house door when he had offered a handshake and a fair deal to a woman who deserved better than the world had given her. And in doing so, he had handed her and himself the key to the only life that had ever fit. People in the territory told the story of the poker game for years. It became one of those stories that gets better. It became one of those stories that gets better in the telling the cowboy who won a bride at cards, the woman who shook his hand in a doorway, the paper marriage that became something that outlasted every challenge thrown at it. He always said Ethan Walker won the game that night. And Ethan always said the same thing when he heard it. He hadn't won anything. He had simply chosen compassion when every other man in that room chose to look away. He had chosen decency when cruelty was on the table. He had chosen to see a person where others saw a prize, and that choice, that single unglamorous, unheroic, nary choice made at midnight in a dusty saloon, had given him everything that mattered. Thomas and May, a ranch that was alive with purpose, a life that was real because they had built it together. By argument, season by season, one small, ordinary, irreplaceable day at a time. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, they sat on the front porch in the chairs that had always been their same porch. Same view, desert sky going gold and deep purple, the way it always did. And Clara had Thomas's letter in her hands. She knew it by heart, just holding it the way you hold things that matter, she said. Same words as that first afternoon with Moss. A decade later, and still true. He knew you, Ethan said. He knew you'd build something worth building. He knew I'd need someone stubborn enough to deserve me. She glanced at him. His word, remember. I remember. Were you? She asked. Enough? He thought about 10 years. The well and the drought and the foals and the fever. Arguments about money and porch repairs and boot placement in hallways. The Sunday dinners with a man who'd sold her in a card game and was slowly, painfully becoming something better than what he'd been. Children asleep inside the house behind them. Probably not, he said, but I kept showing up anyway. She looked at him. As she said, you did. She reached over and took his hand. He held it. Stars came out over Arizona. Cold and brilliant and indifferent, the same stars that had burned over a dusty saloon a decade ago. A boarding house doorway. Two people riding through the desert with the word temporary between them, and no idea how wrong they were. Fate had dealt the cards. Kindness had decided the ending. and the ending which was not an ending at all, but simply the place where one part of a story gives way to the next, was this. Two people on a porch, hand in hand, everyone watching the same sky, with everything they had built humming, alive around them in the dark. It was enough. That was everything. It was the whole, complete, absolute truth of what a life becomes when one person chooses at the right moment, one in the right way, to simply do the decent thing, and they did not let go.